Next we have Dr. Nasha Winters. And Nasha Winters' story is really an amazing story. If you don't know, she was a cancer survivor, the naturopathic physician. At the age of 19, she was diagnosed with end-stage ovarian cancer and only given 3 to 6 months to live at the age of 19. She took actions and empowered her body to detoxify and heal. And now 3 decades later, here she is, and she graduated from Naturopathic College. She specializes in oncology, and from what I had just heard yesterday, she's creating a hospital too, here in Tucson. So if you want to make some donations towards that, that would be great. And she wrote a book. It's called Metabolic Approaches to Cancer. This book here, very good book. And she's recently written another book, yet another book, on mistletoe with Dr. Stephen Johnson. So, she recently became a BRMI board advisor, and we're just delighted to have her here. And she's going to be talking about terrain. So please welcome Dr. Nasha Winters.
Thank you. This is why I love this group. I tell you, you should see the usual groups that I speak to. It's pretty interesting. In fact, I was a little bit nervous to talk to you guys because I feel like I should just say ditto and let's go sit by the pool, because I really think that you get this already. There's only one other group of people who get me as much as I think this organization does, and that is the farmers. Okay, and so it's really interesting. For 6 years, I've been able to speak at the Acres Conference. Anybody familiar with this? Huge regenerative eco-ag permaculture conference, and it's basically the converting of all these conventional farmers back to the old ways, and all the young, new budding farmers who are frankly going to save our butts on this planet. They're the only people who seem to really get it when I start talking about terrain. And so unless you're out of the bioregulatory medical field or a farmer, then we really get each other, we really jive. So here we go. Nothing to disclose, but here I'm going to take you down a little path here of history of just understanding that cancer, we've always had cancer, all of us. In fact, all of us have cancer right now, all of us. And I personally don't believe in such thing as a cure. I believe in such thing as an ongoing, manageable, maintainable process where we are always fortifying our own terrain to be inhospitable to that cancer process getting out of whack, right? So I got a little bit of a pet peeve when people are like ringing their bell at the end of treatment and thinking they're done. In our world, in my world, that's actually just the sound of the bell starting the beginning of the process, or should be the start of the process for anybody. So we want to take a little walk down cancer lane just to kind of get a sense of where we're coming from to where we are now and where we need to go. This is also the process I take patients on, is the chronology of our story. We were talking about story last night, Bobby and I, is that the story isn't where the magic happens. It's what you do with what the story brought you, right? And so helping people understand their story to help invoke a place of action. That's where I kind of like to dive into history lessons and people's own chronology, and I help them understand that their biography is what dictates their biology. And then we're going to talk about a few concepts of this sort of sneaky arising terrain theory in standard of care. They don't know it yet, but they're already starting to think about it and practice it, because you can't not eventually get there. And then the concepts of how I test, assess, address, and don't guess. And then we'll kind of round it out with just sort of these terrain-centric support systems, because we've heard all these cool tools even this morning of what you can do. And I'm here to tell you, as someone will be 31 years out on the 21st of this month from a terminal diagnosis. Thank you. Thank you. But it was never a thing. Nothing I did. There was no treatment that was the answer to this, that was the magic bullet to this. In fact, I'm still on that journey. I'm still learning. It's still revealing itself to me in amazing ways every single day. So hopefully we'll start to together percolate, where do we go from here? Good old Antoine. I tell you, again, I'm speaking to a group of people that you're probably the only group that knows that this guy even existed. Because he was like kind of like having like an arm wrestling contest with Louis Pasteur, and Louis won. Can you just imagine how different our world would be today if we had chosen basically the blue pill over the red pill. It's like the living matrix is happening there. And so this, at the time of my diagnosis, thank God I was going to a small 4-year liberal arts school that was really underfunded, which meant my library was full of really antiquated, outdated textbooks. It's thanks to that that I stumbled upon the work of people like Antoine Beauchamp, that I stumbled upon the work of people like Dr. Inderlein, that I stumbled upon the work of people like Dr. Otto Warburg. Had I not run across that information, I probably wouldn't be here having this conversation with you today, because that soil seed hypothesis made a heck of a lot more sense to me than back in the early 90s when they were still calling cancer a two-hit disease, a two-hit theory disease, that it's just this accumulation of mutations that finally some big genetic mutation thing happens accidentally and you end up having cancer. And so this resonated with me so much more. And I don't know if it was because I was 19, just shy of my 20th birthday, maybe naivety was in my side. I'll take it, but there you have it. So the history. And this even goes back before Virchow, but I kind of start with Virchow because he's sort of considered like our modern day wound healing sort of father of these concepts here, which a lot of the therapies that are being talked about this weekend are about healing the eternal wound, the ongoing wound within our bodies, but be it physical, physiological, emotional, or spiritual. And Dr. Virchow really started talking about this in the mid-1850s. A lot of things started to really change in the mid-1850s, such as the industrialized food revolution, by the way, and starting to hear from people like Pottinger and Weston A. Price, and these guys starting to warn, like telling everyone, gosh, you guys, we ought to be really careful with these things called vaccines. Probably should be worried about that. We probably should be worried about really bad processed food. They were sounding the alarm back in the mid-1800s. Holy cow, right? They're all flipping in their graves right now of what's going on in the world today. But lo and behold, one of the biggest changes that happened was 1914. Dr. Theodore Bovary. Here's what's really interesting is he's probably turning in his grave to see where his theory kind of took off. Because he was just kind of like probably hanging out with some guys, probably drinking a few beers, and like, this is kind of interesting. What if it's just all about the gene? And they kind of started talking about it. He literally never intended, nor did he ever actually prove that the somatic mutation theory was the driving force of cancer, and yet here we are today. This is the driver of every pink ribbon event you ever see, of every Cancer Awareness Month diagnosis, flavor of the month that you see today, and where all of our literally over $1 trillion have gone to in the last 70, 75 years into supporting a theory that has literally never been proven out. A couple years after that, we had good old Otto. Kind of a character. Has anybody read the book Ravenous or seen the documentary? I recommend it. It's about his life. It's fascinating. There's also a documentary coming out called Cancer Revolution in the next year that has a lot of his story, plus a lot of the kind of evolving from somatic mutation to metabolic theory of cancer, and sort of the key players of that from Otto Warburg days through the decades and into today's time, which is a hopeful quest, I think, about where hopefully cancer and cancer care is going in the future. So kind of just showing you that we haven't really moved the needle very far on the dial here, but one of the other people I was lucky enough to read her research that started in the 1980s was Dr. Amina Bissell. Anybody read or seen her TED Talk on her, like basically the extracellular matrix? I like to call it the terrain. But this woman's research all the way back in the 80s, this woman has been shunned and fought. I mean, she is such a hero to me. She's such a badass. She has been doing so much amazing research in the cancer world since the 80s, and yet she's still shunned, and yet her work is still so pivotal in so many lives, including my own. And then we started getting into deuteronomics. How many of you know much about deuterium depletion therapy? All right. Again, I'm hopefully bringing some ideas and concepts that you can go dig a little bit deeper to understand that we're starting to think about the terrain over these last several years. Deuteronomics is about the fact that over time, the levels of deuterium have risen in our life, in our bodies. And deuterium, when it's elevated, is basically a major cause of disease. And a few things when you go in, there's actually a new book on deuteronomics that came out last year. But basically, the types of things that drive deuterium up in our body are things like processed grains. Actually, all grains are high in deuterium. High carbohydrate diets, all right? Stress, microbiome dysfunction, lack of metabolic health. These things all drive up deuterium. And so we can drive deuterium down in our body with just one of the best therapies and cheapest therapies out there for you and your patients, fasting. Probably the most profound therapy we have today to reset so many things happening in our body. And it's all around this crazy little deuterium that I'd love for you to look into. Toft theory, this is all about basically the structure, the stroma of our cells. So kind of like the actual sort of architecture of what's happening in our cytoplasm and in our cells. Many of you probably know Dr. Cowan and Dr. Cowan's work. He speaks a lot in this tribe as well. And he talks about sort of structured water or lack thereof, which is what these really heady researchers and scientists are finding out. Didn't even realize that they were like into this hippy-dippy model. Or the atavastic model of cancer, which is sort of this evolutionary model of cancer, that it's literally been here, it's come to help us. It's come here to reorganize us, to re-inspire us, to reinvigorate us in the most profound way, and yet we treat it like an enemy and we wage war on it, and it's winning. Okay, because at the end of the day, it wants to win, right? Because it's trying to teach us something. It's trying to be a messenger. So we're moving through this kind of history where in a relatively short period of time, something we've had all of our lives, we still don't have the answers for. Even down to the point, and I'm not going to go into the chemistry, especially after lunch, for all of you here, this piece here, but how many of you are familiar with the concept of the hallmarks of cancer? Great. So this is what is the driving force and discussion of all of our research dollars and all of our clinical treatments today in standard of care. The hallmarks of cancer were first defined, there were 6 of them, first defined by Hanahan and his team back in 2000. And they basically were like, here it is, these are the six things that cause cancer. So down to like signaling pathway issues and, issues around the angiogenesis and issues around apoptosis. And notice that they're thinking that those are the causes of cancer. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And then a few years later, almost a decade later, 2011, the same group came along like, guess what? There's 4 more of these things that seem to be a problem when it comes to cancer. And that's when we started talking about metabolic aspects of cancer. That's when they started kind of saying, hey, maybe there's maybe it's some metabolism issues, maybe some fuel sources are driving this show. And then fast forward to October or November of 2021, we've added yet 4 more. Okay, and these are the new 4 more here up at the top. And these articles go into the deep dive. It's incredible, great reading for insomnia. But what will really, the take-home message I want you to have here is that for 20-some years, 22 years at this point, we're no closer to understanding cancer or the drivers of cancer, because it's almost like the more we learn, the more we reveal, the less we know, right? It's almost like, yeah, you look at it closer and it completely changes. And so what I love about how I like to think about the hallmarks of cancer is what makes those hallmarks express. No one's asking those questions, except for you guys and the farmers. No one's asking, well, what makes apoptosis stop working? What makes the metabolic pathways get deranged? What makes angiogenesis happen? This is the types of questions that are not being asked in our trillion-dollar waste of money projects out there. And so just a quick reminder of somatic theory, Bovary's theory from 1914. It's like cancer is just this linear process. It's just this accumulation of mutations that will later build up a tumor, right? And this is where we put all of our ideas, all of our energy, all of our research today. And yet, the metabolic theory, first of all, but one thing about the somatic theory is literally at Johns Hopkins, one end of the campus, you have the somatic theorists, okay? That's Vogelstein's group, that's Tomasetti's group. These is where every couple years you see them do a paper that comes out basically saying we're all screwed, that cancer is just bad luck and it's a Russian roulette game. I'm not kidding, that's actually the title of their articles, right? And so basically that is the least hopeful view of cancer and it will talk about killing your spirit and inducing cancer. I love the talks this morning about how you deal with stress. Like if you believe that this is bad luck and you believe that you're screwed, right? And so then we look at a more, I call like the more hopeful process, the metabolic theory. The idea is that cancers come and go spontaneously. We've shown that many times in renal cell carcinoma, cervical cancers, and that established cancers can remain dormant. I'm living proof of that. Still have, I never did standard of care, still have the tumor in my right ovary, I still have peritoneal implants and carcinomatosis and lesions on my liver, and scarrings in my lungs, and all the things that say I should not be here today and I'm still here. It's because I've learned how to help those cells stay dormant, and that we've kind of found this relationship with each other. And then that changing the terrain, this is coming right out of the metabolic mouths, right, of the research, may prevent progression and contribute to regression of the disease. And that if you manipulate, good old Mina Bissell's work from the 80s, the tumor microenvironment, you can halt and slow the progression. Now, doesn't this sound like a much more thoughtful way to think about cancer and have some hope around it? And at the other end of the Johns Hopkins campus, of the naysayers living in somatic land, you have Dr. Yang Hee Ko and Dr. Pete Peterson, who are all the major contributors of metabolic theory of cancer. And so literally in the same academic institution, respected academic institution, you have extremely differing opinions. So this is my simple version of how do we know that we've debunked the concept that cancer is a genetic disease. And that has been studies that have been done over and over and over and over and over for over 40 years, which is simply a nuclear transfer study, okay? So I'm gonna put this in the most layman's terms as possible, because just that's how my brain thinks, and that's how I'm always using that type of language to explain this to patients, is that you basically take out the DNA hard drive, okay, sort of the nuclei of a cell, and you replace the nuclei of another cell. And so if this was truly a genetic disease, if you took the genetic DNA hard drive out of a cancer cell and you replace that genetic DNA hard drive of a healthy cell, if this is somatic, it should turn that cell on into a cancer cell, and vice versa. That never happens, nor has it ever happened, nor will it ever happen. And so what we do find out is it's like, where the actual problem is at those little organelles floating around the nuclei, those little powerhouses, and the little swimming pool in which they're swimming, the cytoplasm, the jelly, right? In fact, when we're looking at an MRI, what we're looking at is basically goo, like the part that's like sort of destructures. That's where we find cancer. And that's what even I like in Dr. Cowan's book, is he talks about how the cytoplasmic structure, that Toft theory, that sort of architecture, when it's in its proper place, everything else can sort of align in its proper space. And then when you look at what's driving the fuel pathways, the energy pathways of the mitochondria, is what's determining the protection of and the support of our DNA. So we look at somatic mutation theory and we don't throw out that DNA damage is a problem and that genetics are a problem, but you have to go upstream a little bit to where this started. And what I think is so interesting about this concept of the nuclear cell transfer studies is that the problem is actually quite simple and fundamental. And we start to look at things like Dr. Neil McKinney, who's a good friend and colleague and mentor, naturopathic oncologist, specialist, and he talks about down at that level when the mitochondria are really, really damaged by, guess what, life, diet, lifestyle, and issues that accumulate over time, as well as the therapies we're using to treat these cancers. Once those mitochondria become even more deranged, those cancer cells become even more difficult to kill. Our mitochondria are actually in charge of apoptosis. When you look at those hallmarks of cancer, all of that is actually under the expression of your mitochondrial health. And thinking about mitochondria, you guys, they're just bacteria. right? And they're coming from the original mother, our mitochondrial DNA. There is such ancient wisdom that's been carried around, and we're just kind of kicking the snot out of it for the past 150 years or so, and sort of ignoring all of the valuable lessons that these little cells have brought us, have brought here to reveal. And so when we start to think about how we got into this mess, we have to think about this as a process. It's not an event. You did not go to bed last night without cancer and then wake up this morning with it. It doesn't happen that way at all, right? Studies show that it could be anywhere from 7 to 10 years that it's taken for that cancer to get big enough and loud enough to capture your attention. But people like Dr. Argaval from MD Anderson, one of the most famous cancer researchers in the world, said that most of us have actually acquired our cancer process by the time we're 20. And then it's sort of what happens in our lives and the way we meet our stresses and the way we meet ourselves and others that help kind of push it into expression. And so I like to think about this is that everyone's so quick to remove it, to kill it, to destroy it. And yet we're further creating disconnect with ourselves. We're further destroying ourselves. We're further harming ourselves because these cells are arising in us. And if we go after them to kill them, if we commit war on them, we are harming ourselves. So we need to be thinking about this differently. I love this saying, if a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So blaming the flower, this is what we've been doing with tumors. We've been blaming the tumor or the tumor cell or the tumor metabolic pathway if you want to get really, really myopic. And then we somehow go after it even further. We're like, we blame it and then we kill it. You know, it's like, no, we have to do things differently. So the discussion this morning I thought was so, so beautiful when we could see that the BRMI new website was super excited that basically this petal that I created, this lotus here, and the way I think about all of the storytellers of Ayurveda, of anthroposophical medicine, of four temperaments, all of these medical systems, these vitalistic systems, they were simply gathering stories and sharing stories. And that's something we've really lost within ourselves and each other. And so I love that this website is a great resource for people to start to recognize you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't have to throw standard of care out as well, but we certainly don't want to ignore 10,000 years of medical wisdom that's come before this little infant that we're constantly pacifying today, known as standard of care. So these are the types of pieces we start to educate and empower our patients into thinking of themselves as more of part of a system, part of something much more vital and something much bigger than themselves. So here's how I articulate it in the book. This is not a shameless plug for the book, it's just the way I see things, and it's how I've led myself and tens of thousands of patients at this time. In fact, I used to lead women in cancer retreats, and we'd get together on a Friday night, we'd get their labs a few days before, we'd get together on a Friday night and have them go home on a Monday morning and retest their labs a few days later, and they would basically learn everything I taught in that book over a few days, and they'd all leave a little bit like deer in headlights, and like they just sipped water out of a fire hydrant, and they basically are the ones who pushed me to write this book. But we could see complete change in their labs, and we did no treatment. They weren't getting IV mistletoe, they weren't getting IV vitamin C, they weren't getting chemotherapy or off-label drugs, they weren't getting ozone, they got community, they got deep sharing and being listened to. They got deeply nourished, they got inspired, they got educated and empowered, they got a deeper understanding of where they'd come from, where they were, and where their path needed to go. That's what we get to do when we start to dig into what we're putting into our mitochondrial bucket with these 10 drops, be it your epigenetics, what blueprint was passed down from your previous generations that you have the complete control of changing its expression. Whether you're dealing with a metabolic shift, that maybe you've been fueling yourself, depending on your carbs, a little too much for too long. Or maybe your hormones are really imbalanced because you're just drinking out of plastic water bottles and handling your receipts and eating a credit card worth of plastic every month, you know, on average is what they're saying. Or every year. That's pretty creepy. Maybe you're indoors all night, all day, and you don't get out to the sunshine to recharge your battery. I mean, that's why I love that we're having a photodynamic therapy conversation, because it's literally about how to charge your battery with light. And so coming down to those essential determinants, this is what I was saying was happening at all these retreats, was my version of the CDC. Okay? Yeah, boy. Very, very, very far. Boy, did we go really stray far from that over the last couple of years, and all these pieces. And so if you do not have access to the essential determinants, you do not have access to health and vitality and longevity. And the majority of us, even in this room, don't have constant optimal access to these things. You have to work very hard today. Maybe your grandparents didn't have to work this hard. Certainly your great-grandparents didn't. But today it's no longer a matter, I mean, Dr. Walter Crinnion said it best. He's like, it's no longer a matter of if you have toxicity. It's how bad is it and how does it interface with the drops in your personal bucket, right? And then we're telling people, everyone, be so afraid of that giant ball of light in the sky. So cover up and avoid it, right? And avoid it in the time when you're getting the actual UVB that makes your vitamin D. 10 to 2, guys, is when you get your UVB. And they tell you to avoid the sun at 10 to 2, right? And then it takes 3 days to synthesize in your skin. And then you go and take a shower, because by God, you don't want to be smelly. And you go and wash all that away with your detergents and your saponification beauty products. And now everyone's walking around wondering why. They're like, well, I'm out in the sun every day, as they're like covered in every layer and tons of layers of sunscreen that, by the way, blocks UVB and upregulates UVA. These are the types of things that we have now lied to ourselves about and lied to generations about, to be terrified of. I have never seen a melanoma patient with a normal vitamin D level. Has anyone? Ever. Right? Myself included. And so that is really crazy that we just keep giving people more and more terrible, terrible advice. Or a cancer patient, no matter what, don't lose weight. Despite, let's not talk about the literal elephant in the living room. Maybe they're the elephant in the living room that we're not dealing with when this is one of the biggest drivers of metabolic dysfunction. So we use a lot of, this is the place where, even though I talked about the story and the importance of knowing the person, we're also a very data-driven society today. And even more so, if I started out talking about what I know is really causing a lot of people's dysfunction in their body, which is mental, emotional, spiritual stuff that no one wants to talk about. If I started with that 10th drop in the bucket, I would have never gotten my story out there in the world. No one wants to deal with that first. They want to deal with the tangible first, always. Even radical remission, Dr. Kelly Turner, you know, her book talks about the 9, now she's got 10 factors, and of those 10 factors that are actually being shown to help people overcome the sort of the most tragic of conditions, be it cancer or other really aggressive healthcare issues, only 3 of those are now the tangibles: diet, supplements, and exercise. All of the other 7 of these spontaneous remission, radical remission folks that she now has tens of thousands in her database, I'm one of them, go play in that zone. All of those other 7 things have nothing to do with the physical or the tangible. And yet that is the last thing we want to speak about in our culture around this. So I can help people start to explore the physical, because a lot of these little physical tests are also going to start to give me insights to what's going on that biography, on the story, where the vulnerabilities are, maybe where the wounds are, as Rumi says, where the light needs to enter. And so some of those low-hanging fruit factors in metabolic health, this study that came out from Chapel Hill in 2018 showed that 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. That's horrific. But what's more horrific is the study that came out this summer saying, oh, no, just kidding, 6.8% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And when we define metabolic health per standard of care, these are the 5 criteria. And those 5 criteria need a little asterisk that says those criteria met without surgery, like gastric reduction, okay, blood pressure medication, glucophage, metformin, so done naturally. Less than 6.8% of us. we're effed if we don't start dealing with the lowest hanging fruit of all. And this is what's 100% in our ability to change. Despite what the group at Hopkins is telling you that, oh, cancer is just a Russian roulette game, and yet we're finding again and again and again, it's a metabolic derangement, and we're all metabolically deranged. And so it's no wonder that 1 in 2 men and 1 in 2.4 women, as it stands, will have cancer in their lifetime. As I said, we all do already, but as far as it expressing. And the World Health Organization says we'll be doubling our incidence by 2030. Well, when there's only 6.8% of us that are metabolically healthy, of course, what other outcome could there be? And so we have to start to get real. We have to get real to the fact that attacking the tumor is not enough. It is not enough. Attacking yourself is only contributing to the problem. And so this sort of heady article and this heady quote is about like getting down to that fundamental little metabolic pathways that we can now study and reveal. And yet the irony of this quote is you can also impact these same things with light, temperature, stress response, as well as your dietary impact and nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals and off-label drugs. And so this is where it comes back down to a few of the fundamentals. So I've got only a couple minutes left here, but I kind of want people to think about, we really evolved from whole food, real food. And this sort of bottom of our food pyramid, wouldn't that be amazing if that was truly part of all of our true food pyramids, that one of the most foundational things we can do is fast. 13 hours a day of fasting shows that women who've had breast cancer will have 70% reduction in recurrence compared to women who eat, beyond that 13, with less than a 13-hour-a-day window. They're not even asking, they could have been eating Twinkies all day. They were just simply refraining from food for 13 hours, but we are all so wired to think that, oh my God, I can't fall asleep unless I have a snack. I gotta get up in the middle of the night and have a snack. I gotta eat the second amount of bed. I have to eat every 2 hours for me to feel good. If you are one of those people, you are metabolically broken. If you can't go 13 hours comfortably, okay, you got some work to do. All right, and so these are some of the fundamentals. So I can't help anybody unless their foundation is, their nourishment and their foundation is set. No therapy. Mistletoe therapy won't work in low vitamin D levels and low omega-3 fatty acid with high omega-6 ratio levels. Low-dose naltrexone doesn't work in that environment. Guess what else doesn't work in that environment? Your standard of care immunotherapies. You have to have good fatty acid balance. You have to have good vitamin D levels. These are the things that came from just nourishing ourselves with light, sun, food, community. And this little handout, kind of leaving it for you here, okay? I give this to every single patient. It is so helpful. I used to just give it to the kids, but I tell you, their parents needed it a lot more than they did. It's like, everyone's like terrified, like, I don't want to be too cold. I just want to be 74 degrees all the time. No, you have to create a little bit of stress. You have to have a little bit of hormesis. That's why I get up in public speak, because this is my best form of hormesis ever, is my absolute terror of public speaking. And yet I do it again and again because this information is so critical to our very livelihoods. And so there are so many things. That's why I said I just think we should all go outside, maybe do some hot and cold therapies, lay in the sun, maybe, I love all the biohackers that are now like sunning their perineums. I mean, like it makes me really happy of all these things, but there is so much that we can do that are fundamental, that are free, that are available to everybody, no matter your socioeconomic status. And yet we're so far from this. We're so nature deficient. The average American spends less than 15 minutes outdoors every day, right? It's so crazy. And most of us are living in urban environments where the only thing we see is concrete, another wall outside our window. And so this concept that health and longevity are dependent on our ability to adapt, I heard this theme play itself out a lot today. The changes in the world around us in a pretty short period of time, we have not been able to catch up with these changes. Right? Our body is like, what is happening here? And so that we can literally rewire our biology to rewrite our biography, but I also believe the other way around. You can rewrite your own story to change your biography just as importantly. And so with that, got a couple little things you could read on, all right? And definitely ways to contact me. and then a million different resources. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah. You guys. Oh wait, questions. Okay. Now you're embarrassing me. Thank you. Aww.
Contact page back up?
When I was diagnosed, 31 years ago, I had about a year and a half into my process when first of all, I was like, I'm still alive. No one knew what to do with me. So the fact that I was still alive, no one even wanted to touch me. So I started having these crazy visions, downloads. Okay, it sounds very esoteric and woo-woo, but it just is what it is. And I saw this place very specifically, very, very, very specifically. And it has stayed with me ever since. And this hospital concept has come to fruition, come very close to fruition over the years. But we're now getting closer than ever. In fact, we now have the land, which looks exactly what the vision looked like. I know, it's crazy. It is about 2 hours south of here.
Excellent.
So it's, I get this, but here's this place. So imagine a 1,000-acre campus that 75% of the campus is biodynamic, organic, regenerative agriculture. Okay, so we're living on a farm, right? And on that farm, we had it on that farm. But then we also have on this campus, we've got things like the farm-to-table restaurant. We have an event center. Wouldn't it be cool to go to a conference where you're in an environment where you're not getting sick? Like I woke up this morning with a headache because no matter how good the environments are we go to, this is not natural. None of this is natural that we're in, carpets and all the things. So imagine a conference center that can hold 1,000 people that it will be out there. Very intentional communities, very multi-mix, multi-use, multi-socioeconomic status residential communities. Everything from early childhood development centers to assisted living centers and even hospice on that campus. So basically a very intentional community. And then we have this 80-bed, 250,000 square foot integrative oncology hospital and research institute that is completely nonprofit, off the grid, completely stepping out of all the medical systems as we know it, because I spent 20 years of my life and career trying to change the system, trying to fix the system. And the only thing I came to the conclusion of is either that was going to cause my cancer to start getting really pissed off again, start taking over, which she's tried to do a few times, or I just had to build something entirely new. And for many years I was doing it by myself. But something's been happening in the last decade that I keep finding more and more people who have a similar vision, and we're coming together and we're making this happen. Thanks, Chip. Yeah. So be on high alert for early 2023 as we get to start sharing with the world what's going on in your backyard. So thank you.